We're going to check in now on the debate about genetically modified foods. Chances are you eat them all the time. We were told some years ago that Ottawa was studying the health effects on Canadians. Wait till you hear what happened. And now that human drugs and vaccines are being developed in plants, could they accidentally end up on your dinner table? The CBC's Kelly Crow has this feature story.
GMO, just say no to the GMO, say G. GMO, I just say no to the GMO. Something's fishy about this tomato, don't you know it's a GMO?
We feel the opportunities of this technology far outweigh any perceived or actual risk.
Any politician who tells you these products are safe and that is known through scientific testing is either very, very stupid or they're lying.
Genetically modified plants, a blessing or a curse? It's an argument that has raged for 10 years. All the while, the plants themselves have been quietly flourishing on millions of farms all over the world. They are plants born in a laboratory, where scientists cracked open their DNA and inserted new genes from unrelated species. When the first seeds were planted, there was no fanfare, just a few farmers taking advantage of new technology that promised to make their life easier. Today, more than 80% of Canadian canola, 30% of corn, and a quarter of the soybean crop is genetically modified. Renee Van Acker has spent 10 years watching this revolution in the fields, not as a cheerleader nor an opponent, but as a scientist concerned that the right questions are asked and answered.
When we talk about this, there's a whole cohort of people that immediately shut us out and just say, oh, you're anti-GM. You know, we don't even want to hear anything because you're just anti-GM. And we're not. I'm not anti-GM. And I don't know how many times I've stated that, and over the last decade I've stated it thousands of times. But we're not anti-GM. We're saying, look, yes, move forward on the technology, but there are going to be some problems. Let's deal with those problems so we don't kill the rest of the technology.
Anything with soybeans in it is a threat.
But now you know. It wasn't until the first GM crops went to market that the controversy began. Were these new plants safe to eat? The government regulators said yes. And today there are GM ingredients in much of the processed food on the grocery shelves. It's been 10 years of eating GM food with no obvious health problems, but not all the scientists are convinced that it's safe. 3 years ago, a study in the journal Nutrition and Health concluded much more scientific effort and investigation is necessary before we can be satisfied that eating foods containing GM material in the long term is not likely to provoke any form of health problems. In other words, even with GM ingredients in most processed food, scientists can't say for sure that it's safe to eat.
There's a little bit of evidence that it might be harmful. There's other evidence that shows that it's not harmful. But there's very few studies overall. I mean, you have a handful of studies on both sides, and as a scientist, you know, balancing information in a science-based approach, you'd have to say, I don't have enough information.
Health Canada did announce back in 2002 that it would watch the Canadian population for signs of health problems from eating GM food.
I think it's just prudent and what the public expects that we will keep a careful eye on the health of Canadians.
But when we checked back for this story, we found that Health Canada had abandoned that research less than a year later, saying it was too difficult to put an effective surveillance system in place. So at this point, there is little research into the health effects of genetically modified food. So will we ever know for sure? Is it safe?
I don't know. You know, those studies are still not being funded. Sometimes people say, well, in North America, you know, it's just one big experiment and we're all part of it.
If GM crops are an experiment, the evidence so far suggests it's difficult to control a gene once it's out there in nature. And over the last 10 years, GM critics have had lots of chances to say, I told you so. The most famous story, Starlink corn. the gene that was not approved for human food, but somehow ended up in taco shells and other corn intended for human consumption. It was hard to get rid of. Even several years later, the gene was still mysteriously showing up in corn. Another example of genes on the loose, GM canola, growing where it wasn't planted and wasn't wanted, and now it contaminates almost the entire Canadian canola crop. Some experimental GM pigs were accidentally rendered for animal food in Canada. Some other experimental GM pigs accidentally ended up in human food in the U.S. And just this summer, another kind of GM corn not yet approved was accidentally planted and then accidentally shipped to Europe. Last month, U.S. officials announced that a form of GM rice was unintentionally released. And U.S. scientists have just discovered that an experimental GM grass designed for better golf greens has escaped into the wild. So far, none of the incidents have posed a human health threat. But what if the genes had contained dangerous drugs or toxic chemicals? Because one day they will. It's the next generation of GM plants, designed to be tiny drug factories, making human vaccines, proteins, drugs, industrial chemicals, even plastics, in the leaves of plants. Stephen Yarrow at the Federal Canadian Food Inspection Agency will be responsible for approving this new generation of GM plants.
And our concern about that future on the horizon is that it's very important that those types of plants are kept completely separate from the food and feed production systems.
But the question is how to keep them separate when experience has already shown that genes escape.
I mean, the whole food system is at stake. If we start, cavalierly putting these things into food and feed plants, without a decent plan for containment, or without really understanding how one contains these species.
Research is showing that plants are difficult to contain. Here, a scientist is studying alfalfa, some of it growing as a crop in the field, and some of it growing wild in the ditch, where the seeds can survive for 70 years. A problem if those seeds contain a dangerous drug or chemical. Government officials say they're asking industry not to use food plants to grow drugs.
Well, we're waiting to see what develops, but we are consulting with the industry, certainly urging them not to use some of the basic feed and food producing crops such as canola and corn and so on. So we'll have to see what the industry develops and what types of plants that they wish to put these type of traits into.
But there is no law to prevent the use of food crops, and in the U.S. most of the field trials have used corn, and there has already been a mistake. An experimental plot of corn modified to grow a human hepatitis vaccine accidentally showed up in soybeans headed for market.
Why are we doing this? Why would somebody choose corn to do that? Really bad idea, Why would they put it in a food or feed crop? Well, they're doing it because they can. It's easy. It's easy to do in corn because they have the systems in place, and it's cheap. It makes the production very, very cheap. Well, yeah, but what's the risk? The risk is huge.
At the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Stephen Yarrow says there should be a public debate about this future of molecular farming.
We're changing the nature of agriculture with these types of advances, or potentially could be. And I think it's very important that Canadians understand the risks and the benefits of this type of technology before it becomes advanced.
10 years ago, a revolution began with a canola plant. Today, there are genetically modified glowing zebrafish, fast-growing salmon, GM pigs, and plants that make human proteins and drugs. So far, none of these second-generation GM products have been approved for the marketplace, but they are coming. Kelly Crow, CBC News, Toronto.
And a totally different subject, I've done a lot of eugenics research here with Alex. I've read literally hundreds of publications, looked at everything, and this is the first time I've ever seen in detail a single-page smoking gun document that just covers so much of it. Everything you've heard about eco-science, which was published in 1977 from the White House, science advisor John P. Holdren, is outlined here in this 1969 document. It's a private secret memo to Bernard Berelson, who was president at the time of the Population Council, which was founded by John Rockefeller III in 1950s, to the president, or from rather, the president of Planned Parenthood World Population, Frederick S. Jaffe. Jaffe's the one who wrote this memo, and it outlines proposed measures to reduce U.S. fertility by universality or selectivity of impact. That means ways they're going to constrain the population. Now, of course, they've been doing this in third world countries for decades, but this key document came out only a couple of years before they started arguing in 1971 for Roe versus Wade, effectively legalizing abortion in this country, which would later become a tool to target particularly the black population, but also all kinds of Americans, now more than 50 million aborted babies in this country. Anyway, what's important in this document is how they specifically target the family and even talk about putting fertility control agents in the water supply. Why do we have all this BPA, all these pharmaceuticals, all these weird substances, and the fluoride as well in the water? Why do we have all these bad chemicals in our food, all the genetically modified problems they know about, but won't stop and keep pushing through with automatic regulation in the FDA? It's because they want to lower the population. They've been doing it across the country, across the world. Now they want to do it in this country. They've been doing it actively since '69. It talks about restructuring the family, getting people to postpone or avoid marriage, altering the image of the ideal size of family. It talks about compulsory education of children, encouragement of increased homosexuality. Right here on paper. I'm not making this up, people. Educate for family limitation, fertility control agents in water supply. It's right here on this memo. Came out in this Frederick Jaffe's papers while he was at Planned Parenthood years later. And it also encourages women to work. So they can't be at home taking care of their families and having more babies. Instead, they must go to work. But they're not going to treat those women well, according to this document. They're going to do everything they can to take away the tax incentives for married couples, for people with more than 2 children. It says right here, under a subject I don't even understand, chronic depression, it says require women to work and provide few child care facilities, limit and eliminate public finance, medical care, scholarships, housings, loans, subsidies, everything for families with too many children. And it even talks about having permits to be allowed to have children, limiting childbirth to only a certain sector of adults, and compulsory abortion for out-of-wedlock pregnancies. Whether or not you think some of these ideas individually might be advisable because you think there's too many people, this is draconian authoritarianism, and they tried to bring it to America. It was written about in Eco-Science, but as I'm going to show you in these clips, it was practiced in countries including China. China is the world model for the stuff that's on this document for the United States. Before they had the one-child policy, they had their family planning programs, which is part of the worldwide Planned Parenthood group, advising people, encouraging them, using propaganda, loudspeakers, everything to get people to have first only 2 children, first to delay their marriage, but then, as you see, later to only be allowed to have 1 child at the penalty of the police state's gun. Let's play some of those clips right now from the Barefoot Doctors of China in 1975, 4 years before the one-child policy.
One of the most important aspects of China's family planning campaign is providing jobs for women. Women comprise 80% of the employees at this lock factory. The factory's barefoot doctors keep track of the women's menstrual cycles and deliver birth control pills at the proper time.
Okay, stop it right there. So I just want to point out they have admitted they're encouraging women to work as a major plank of their family planning program and even regulating their menstrual cycles. We think this is okay. No, it's a scientific takeover of humanity. They are restricting the natural birth cycle of humans. Whether or not you think there's too many people or whatever, I don't think we want an authoritarian scientific dictatorship in charge. Let's go on with the clips, please.